Puppy digs up yard secret, what the owner found change her life forever. Emily Tanner had always lived a life of quiet routine. At 32, she found herself in a comfortable, though somewhat predictable, existence in the suburbs of a mid-sized town. Her house was modest, nothing too extravagant, but well-kept and cozy. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really changed. On the outside, Emily's life looked orderly. Her neighbors would see her walking her energetic Labrador, Max, every morning and evening, exchanging pleasantries with the few people who were close enough to wave or stop for small talk. She worked from home as a graphic designer, which allowed her a level of flexibility and solitude that suited her introverted nature. If you love animals and want to watch more amazing stories, don't forget to subscribe to help the author. Let's begin. However, Emily's life, while peaceful, had begun to feel a little empty. It wasn't that she had everything she could want. She was financially stable, had her own house, and, for the most part, enjoyed her job. But something had shifted in her. She had begun to feel disconnected, not just from her surroundings, but from herself. It wasn't an urgent sense of loneliness, but a quiet gnawing feeling that, over the years, had grown louder. Emily realized that she felt adrift. While she had friends, acquaintances more than close confidants, and was well-liked by her colleagues, the truth was, she didn't really have anyone with whom she could be herself, someone who truly understood her. The distance in her relationships wasn't just with others, it was with her own past, too. Emily had long ago distanced herself from much of her family. It wasn't an active decision, more of a gradual retreat, a slow fade from something that once felt vibrant but had over time become strained. Her mother lived a short drive away, but their conversations often felt superficial, focused on casual updates and mundane topics. They hadn't had a real conversation in years. Her father, who had passed away when Emily was 15, had been a larger-than-life figure, but his death had left a gaping hole in the family that never quite healed. Emily's siblings, once close, had drifted in different directions, each of them building their own lives away from the nest. Her sister lived overseas with her husband and children, and her brother had moved to the city, where he worked long hours and was rarely in touch. The one person Emily felt she could always rely on, in some ways, had been her grandmother, Agnes. Agnes had been a stalwart presence in Emily's life, a woman whose laughter and strength had left a lasting impression on her. It was Agnes who had taught Emily how to cook, how to garden, and how to sew. It was Agnes who, when Emily was upset, would sit with her for hours, listening without judgment. She had been a source of wisdom and love, and after her passing when Emily was in her late 20s, Emily had felt as though a piece of her childhood had died with her. But there was something mysterious about Agnes's past. As a child, Emily had always been fascinated by the stories her grandmother told, though some of them seemed to hint at long-hidden truths. Agnes had never spoken much about her earlier years, her life before she became a grandmother. She would occasionally share anecdotes from her youth, but these moments were often fleeting and accompanied by a glance of sadness in her eyes. Emily had never thought to press her grandmother for more details. In her mind, Agnes was a woman who had lived a full, rich life, and her role as a mother and grandmother seemed to be the culmination of everything that had come before. But as Emily grew older, a feeling lingered that there was more to her grandmother's story than she had let on. This feeling of curiosity became more pronounced after Agnes passed away. Emily inherited her grandmother's house, a small cottage on the outskirts of town. It was filled with relics of another time. Faded photographs, antique furniture, and handwritten journals, all of which Emily had put aside. The house was a place that brought both comfort and sorrow. The walls held memories of laughter and tears, and Emily found herself visiting the house less frequently as time passed. It was as if the weight of all the untold stories in that place had become too much to bear. There was a particular object in the house that had always intrigued Emily, an old, worn trunk hidden in the attic. Agnes had always been tight-lipped about it, and when Emily was younger, she'd been too intimidated to open it. Now, as an adult, Emily occasionally wondered about the contents of that trunk, but the thought of uncovering something that could shift her understanding of her grandmother felt like an intrusion. Agnes was gone, and with her, the comfort of knowing the past was sealed away in the safety of her silence. In the years since Agnes's death, Emily's family had drifted further apart. Her mother had never really recovered from her mother's passing, retreating into a world of routine and quiet grief. Emily, too, had found herself trapped in the monotony of her own life, never quite able to break free from the cycles of work and solitude. She often wondered what her life would be like if she had a stronger connection to her roots, to the family history she had left behind. Yet, she didn't feel any compelling need to make the effort to reconnect. She had Max, and that was enough. But even though Emily was not actively seeking out relationships or answers, there was still a deep longing inside her that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't a need for grand adventure or dramatic change. She didn't want to leave her home or upend her life. Instead, it was the quiet yearning for something more meaningful, something that connected her to her past and, perhaps, to herself. She had grown tired of the superficiality of her daily existence. She craved a deeper understanding of who she was, where she came from, and what stories had been lost along the way. It wasn't until Max, her rambunctious Labrador puppy, started digging in the yard that the opportunity for change came into view. Max had been with Emily for just over a year. He was a large, boisterous dog with an insatiable curiosity and a seemingly endless supply of energy. He spent hours in the backyard, running after squirrels, rolling in the grass, and more recently, digging in strange spots that Emily couldn't quite understand. Sometimes she would laugh at his antics, other times she'd scold him for tearing up the flower beds, but in the back of her mind, she had a sense that Max was searching for something. It was, in many ways, a perfect reflection of Emily's own internal restlessness. On an ordinary afternoon, while Emily was sitting on the porch enjoying a cup of tea, Max began to dig in a corner of the yard near the old oak tree. His paws flew through the dirt with surprising intensity, and soon he had a sizable hole. Emily called out to him, not thinking much of it, until she noticed that his digging seemed deliberate, almost as though he was on a mission. Intrigued, she grabbed a small shovel and went over to help him. Together, they unearthed something unexpected, an old, weathered box. It was buried deep in the earth, its edges worn and cracked by time. Emily's heart raced as she knelt beside Max, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. The box was unlike anything Emily had ever seen before. It was made of wood, its surface faded and scarred by the years, but it felt heavy, substantial, as if it held something of importance. Emily's mind raced with possibilities. Could this be something of value? A forgotten treasure from a previous owner of the house? Or perhaps something far more personal, a piece of family history long buried in the sands of time? Max looked up at her, his tail wagging as if to say, "I found something, now what do we do with it?" It was that question, the one that echoed in Emily's mind, that propelled her forward. She carefully pried open the box, wondering what she might find inside. As the lid creaked open, she was greeted by a musty smell, a mixture of aged paper and dust. Inside, there were several faded photographs, yellowed with age, and a bundle of letters, tied together with a ribbon. The sight of these artifacts, so intimate and personal, sent a shiver down her spine. Emily carefully picked up the letters, her fingers trembling slightly as she untied the ribbon and began to unfold them. What she would soon discover, as she began reading the letters, would change the course of her life in ways she never could have imagined. But before that moment, before she even realized the weight of the discovery she had made, Emily had no idea that she was about to uncover a long-buried family secret, one that would bring her closer to the past than she ever thought possible. Max's seemingly random digging had unearthed not just a box, but the first thread of a story that would tie Emily to her family's lost history and ultimately reshape the way she saw her own life. The first moment Emily laid eyes on the box was strange, like something out of a forgotten dream, its worn surface beckoning her to open it. For a moment, she just stared at it, the weight of what she might uncover sitting heavy in her chest. Max, her loyal Labrador, still panted beside her, clearly satisfied with his discovery, but Emily stood motionless, caught between curiosity and hesitation. And her eyes. There was an unspoken distance between them, something that had grown over the years, and neither of them knew how to bridge it. The conversation between them had long since become stilted, filled with superficial comments about the weather, her work, her brother and sister, but never anything of real substance. "Mom, I need to ask you something," Emily began, after they exchanged pleasantries and had settled in the living room. Her mother's eyes shifted slightly, a flicker of concern crossing her face. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. "Do you remember anything about Grandma Agnes's past? I mean, about her life before she became a grandmother?" Karen looked surprised at the question, her brows furrowing. "Why do you ask about that now?" she said, her voice more cautious than usual. "You know your grandmother never spoke much about her younger years." "I found something, Mom," Emily said, her voice shaking slightly as she pulled out the bundle of letters. "I found these in the backyard, buried in a box. They were addressed to someone named Samuel. Do you know who that is?" At the mention of the name Samuel, Karen's face went pale. She leaned back in her chair, her hand tightening around the armrest. I don't know, Emily. I never heard your grandmother mention anyone by that name." Emily could see the discomfort in her mother's expression, and it only fueled her desire to learn more. "You don't know, or you don't want to talk about it?" She pressed, her tone a bit sharper than she had intended. Her mother's silence spoke volumes. The unease in the room was palpable. "What happened to him, Mom? Why did Grandma never tell us about him? What is all of this?" Karen finally sighed, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of a long-held secret had just become too much to bear. "Your grandmother had a life before she became the matriarch of this family, Emily. A life none of us knew about, at least not in detail. It wasn't something we ever talked about." Emily's heart pounded as she listened intently, waiting for more. She had always known that there were gaps in her family's history, but she had never imagined it was something so deeply hidden. What was it about her past that was so dangerous to talk about? Why didn't she ever share it with us? Her mother hesitated, her eyes shifting away, unwilling to meet Emily's gaze. Finally, she spoke in a low voice. "It wasn't dangerous, Peresi. It was just complicated. Your grandmother, she made some choices when she was young that she regretted. She fell in love with a man who wasn't right for her, and it caused a lot of pain for our family. After everything happened, she just chose to move on and leave it all behind." Emily's mind raced. She could sense there was more to the story, but Karen seemed determined to protect something, perhaps even herself. Emily didn't want to push too hard, but her frustration was mounting. "What do you mean? Was it right for her? What happened to him? Why did Grandma leave him behind?" Her mother shook her head, looking down at her lap. "I can't tell you everything, Emily. Some stories are better left in the past." Emily's frustration flared. This wasn't the closure she was seeking. This wasn't the answer that would give her the peace she needed. "I can't just leave it, Mom. I need to know more about what happened. This man, Samuel, he's part of our family story, and we deserve to know the truth." Karen stood abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You don't understand. Sometimes the past is better left buried, Emily," she said sharply. "You should just let it go." Emily's heart sank. Her mother's refusal to share more only heightened her need to uncover the truth. But now, she knew there was no turning back. She couldn't unlearn what she had already discovered, and she couldn't ignore the fact that there was a deeper story to be told. Her mother's silence had only pushed Emily further into the unknown, urging her to seek out more answers. Answers that, for reasons she couldn't yet explain, felt as though they were tied to her own identity. After her conversation with her mother, Emily left feeling more determined than ever. She realized that finding the truth would not be easy. There would be resistance and there would be emotional barriers. But the desire to understand her grandmother's story and the mystery of Samuel was too strong to ignore. Emily wasn't just looking for answers. She was searching for a connection to the family she had distanced herself from, to the history that had been hidden from her, and, ultimately, to herself. She spent the next few days doing what she could to learn more about Agnes's past. She dug through old family records in her grandmother's attic, scouring the boxes of mementos and forgotten letters. Each piece of evidence she uncovered led to more questions. There were no clear answers about Samuel, no clues that tied him to anything tangible. Broken them both. It was a painful truth, but at least it was the truth. She leaned back in her chair, allowing the quiet weight of the room to settle over her. But as the initial thrill of discovery faded, something unexpected began to tug at her heart. There was an emptiness that followed, a deep and abiding sorrow that gnawed at her as the silence in the room stretched on. Yes, she had uncovered the truth, but with it came an undeniable sense of loss. The realization hit Emily like a physical blow. In searching for the truth about her great-grandmother's past, she had inadvertently exposed herself to a deeper pain than she had anticipated. She had unlocked the door to Agnes's heartache, and in doing so, she had confronted her own. What had Agnes lost in the process of this forbidden love? What had Samuel lost? And, perhaps more unsettling, what had Emily herself lost in the pursuit of this history? The truth about Samuel was not the final answer she had been hoping for. It did not offer the resolution she had imagined. It didn't fix anything. It merely exposed the rawness of the human heart. Agnes had loved deeply, and she had been forced to let that love go. But even in that painful release, there had been no redemption, no reunion, no closure. Agnes had lived the rest of her life carrying the weight of that unfulfilled love, never allowing it to be spoken of again, and leaving behind only the scars that had shaped Emily's own family. Emily had wanted to understand her great-grandmother, but now that she did, she wasn't sure what to do with it. She had assumed that finding the truth would give her clarity, that it would be a kind of balm for the wounds that had lingered between her and her own family. But the discovery had only revealed more questions, more complexities. And now she was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the truth is not a source of healing. It is a force that reshapes everything, leaving you forever changed. The next day, Emily reached out to her mother, Karen, and her Aunt Linda, determined to share what she had uncovered. She needed to do something with this knowledge, to share it with her family, even if the consequences were uncertain. She had come to understand that the past was not something that could be buried forever. It needed to be acknowledged, even if it was painful. The conversation took place over dinner at her mother's house, a tense and awkward affair that began with pleasantries and ended with the unraveling of yet another layer of family history. Emily was prepared for her mother's resistance, but it was Linda who surprised her. When Emily shared what she had learned about Samuel's forced departure, the manipulation by his family, the emotional toll it had taken on Agnes, there was a brief silence. Then Linda, who had always been the quiet one, spoke up. "That's what happened, isn't it?" Linda said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made Emily pause. "Your grandmother never wanted to talk about it, but we all knew. It was part of our family's history, part of the way your grandmother lived the rest of her life. She was heartbroken, and she never let anyone forget it. She was a strong woman, but she carried that sadness with her. It shaped everything she did, everything we did." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. It wasn't just Agnes's heartache that had been passed down. It was the silence, the unspoken grief, the refusal to address the deep pain that had torn apart a family. Emily's mother, Karen, had never fully understood her grandmother's silence, nor had she been able to express her own grief about it. And now Emily realized that she had inherited that same silence. She had spent her life avoiding the raw emotions of her family's past, distancing herself from the pain, and now she was faced with the fact that this avoidance had shaped her own relationships. She had spent years building walls around her heart, and it had cost her dearly. As the evening wore on, Emily listened to her family's reluctant admissions, their fragmented recollections of Agnes's life. They spoke of her resilience, her strength, but also of the emotional cost of living a life so constrained by duty and unspoken love. And in that moment, Emily began to understand the weight of what she had uncovered. The truth she had sought was not a simple answer. It was a mirror, reflecting back at her all of the hidden emotions and unresolved conflicts that had been passed down through generations. It was in that moment of reckoning that Emily realized that the discovery of the past, of the love between Agnes and Samuel, had not been about finding a neat resolution. The victory she had once thought she would feel upon uncovering the truth now seemed hollow. There was no neat ending to this story, only the endless unraveling of the emotional knots that had been tied over generations. Her journey to uncover the past had brought her closer to her family, but it had also revealed just how far they had drifted from one another. Emily had sought closure, but instead, she had opened a door that led only to more questions. And in doing so, she had realized that the past was not something to be fixed. It was something to be lived with, something to be understood, and ultimately, something that could shape the future only if it was acknowledged and accepted for what it was. Emily stood up from the dinner table, the weight of the evening settling over her. She had wanted answers, but she had received something much more complex, a new understanding of herself, of her family, and of the emotional legacies that define them all. She hadn't found closure, but she had found something more important: the ability to face the truth, to embrace the complexity of love and loss, and to begin the long journey of healing, not just for herself, but for the generations that had come before her. The truth had not been the easy victory she had hoped for, but it had, in the end, been the most profound revelation of all. The relief that Emily had felt upon discovering the truth about Samuel's disappearance was short-lived. In the days that followed her revelation, something inside her began to unravel. She had assumed that uncovering her great-grandmother's long-hidden story would bring clarity, maybe even a sense of peace. But the deeper Emily dug, the more her understanding of her own life and relationships began to shift. What had seemed like a straightforward pursuit of knowledge had transformed into something far more complicated, and with each new piece of information, Emily found herself lost in a maze of emotions she was ill-prepared to navigate. It wasn't just the history of her great-grandmother's love that was now weighing on Emily, it was everything that had been uncovered in its wake. The more she learned about Agnes's painful past, the more Emily saw parallels between her great-grandmother's choices and her own. Agnes had lived a life of restraint, of suppression, of avoiding what she truly wanted because of societal pressures. Emily had done the same. In her own way, she had avoided the messiness of her emotions, choosing a path of independence and self-sufficiency instead of risking vulnerability with her family. And now, Emily realized the truth about her great-grandmother's life wasn't the only thing she had uncovered. It was a mirror of her own. The first signs that something was wrong came when Emily tried to share her findings with her mother, Karen. Emily had hoped that the revelation of Samuel's fate would bridge the emotional distance between them, but instead, it only seemed to create a deeper divide. Karen, who had always been distant and emotionally closed off, reacted with an almost cold detachment. She listened to Emily's story, but didn't share her excitement, her curiosity, or even her sorrow. The more Emily spoke, the more she felt a sense of rejection from her mother, as if the discovery had awakened something painful in Karen's own past, something she was unwilling to face. "I don't know why you're so focused on all this," Karen had said flatly, setting down her cup of coffee. "You're not going to change anything, Emily. All this digging around in the past, it doesn't help. It just hurts." The words stung, not just because they felt dismissive of Emily's discovery, but because they revealed the emotional walls Karen had carefully built over the years. Emily had expected this reaction in a way. She had always known that her mother wasn't comfortable with emotions, wasn't willing to talk about anything too difficult. But hearing her say it out loud, in such a dismissive tone, made Emily feel the full weight of her family's emotional distance. It was as though, despite her best efforts, she could never break through to the heart of the people she loved. The tension only increased when Emily shared her findings with her Aunt Linda. Linda, who had been so open in the earlier dinner conversation, now grew quiet as soon as the topic of Samuel came up. At first, like-hated nature of love and family, the answers she had sought about Samuel, about Agnes, about herself, were not as important as the questions that remained unanswered. It was the space between the answers, the gap between the discovery and the understanding, that had allowed her to grow. The next day, Emily called her mother, Karen. She had been avoiding this conversation for weeks. After all that had transpired, she wasn't sure how to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. But Emily knew that the only way forward was to open herself up to her family, to confront the silence, the distance, and the pain that had festered for so long. "Mom," Emily began softly when Karen picked up the phone, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About Agnes, about Samuel, about us." Karen's voice on the other end of the line was quiet, but not unkind. "I don't know what you want me to say, Emily. You've uncovered a lot of things, and I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about them." Emily took a deep breath. "I know. I've been thinking a lot about that, too. About how much we've avoided talking about our own history. How much we've kept things buried. But we can't move forward if we keep pretending it's all okay." There was a long pause. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Karen finally said, her voice trembling with something that sounded like sadness. "I don't know if I can go back and unpack all of that." "Neither do I," Emily replied softly, the words coming from a place of deep understanding. "But we can start small. We can start by acknowledging that the past is part of us, even if we don't have all the answers. We can start by just being honest with each other about what happened, about what we're feeling now." Karen let out a long sigh, the silence on the other end of the line filled with the weight of years of unspoken words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Karen spoke again. "I never wanted to talk about all of that because I didn't want to burden you with it. You and Linda, I thought you'd be better off without knowing the full story. But maybe I was wrong." Emily felt the sting of tears in her eyes. It was a rare thing for her mother to speak so openly, and it made the distance between them seem both painful and undeniable. But there was something else in Karen's voice, too. A flicker of hope. A willingness, perhaps, to begin again. "I don't need everything to make sense, Mom," Emily said, her voice steady despite the emotions swelling inside her. "I just need us to start talking. Maybe we can't fix everything. Maybe we can't make all the pieces fit perfectly. But we can start by being honest about how we feel. We can share our truths, even if they're messy and incomplete." Over the next few weeks, Emily continued to make space for these difficult conversations. She reached out to Linda, who had been just as distant as Karen, but in her own way. Linda, too, had been carrying her own burdens, and the revelation about Agnes's secret had unearthed long-buried emotions. It wasn't easy, but Emily could sense a shift in both of them. Slowly, cautiously, they began to talk. About their mother. About Agnes. About Samuel. About what had been left unsaid for so many years. It wasn't an easy conversation. It wasn't a smooth road to reconciliation. But the act of sharing, of listening, of accepting that the past was part of their collective story, this was the beginning of healing. For the first time in a long while, Emily felt that she was truly part of something bigger than herself. The walls she had built around her, the emotional isolation she had lived in for years, began to crumble. She realized that connection, real, authentic connection, was not about having all the answers. It wasn't about fixing the past or finding a neat resolution. It was about being present, about showing up for each other, even when the road ahead seemed unclear. Emily's relationship with her mother and aunt was far from perfect. It wasn't a story of complete healing, of neat closure, but it was a story of growth, of learning to embrace the complexities of love, family, and history, of learning to share the pain, the joy, and the messy, imperfect truth of being human. As the weeks went on, Emily continued to reflect on the journey she had taken. She had gone from a place of searching, of desperation for answers, to a place of understanding. She had learned to face the past, not as something that could be fixed, but as something that had shaped her, that had shaped all of them. And in doing so, she had begun to see her own future in a new light. Not as a series of neatly tied-up events, but as a journey, one that would continue, with all its unknowns, its joys, and its sorrows. And for the first time, Emily was ready to embrace it, armed with the truth she had found, and the wisdom that came from knowing that the journey itself was just as important as the destination.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.